Rachel stood in the courtroom, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her heart pounding as the judge looked down at her. "You are facing serious charges," Judge Howard said, flipping through the case file. "Assault. Battery. Hospitalizing a fellow student. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Rachel took a slow breath, glancing at the prosecutor, the spectators, the police officers standing at the back of the room. They all thought she was just another reckless teenager who had let her temper get the best of her. She turned her gaze back to the judge, her voice steady as she said the words that would change everything. "Your Honor, I am not a high school student. My name is Rachel Brooks, and I am a police officer working undercover." Judge Howard adjusted his glasses and looked down at the girl standing before him. She looked like any other high school student, long, light brown hair, jeans, sneakers, and a simple zip-up hoodie. Her posture was tense, her hands gripping the edges of the table, and her eyes, though wide with nerves, held a sharpness that didn't quite match the frightened demeanor of a typical teenager in court. "State your name for the record," he said, flipping through the case file. "Sarah Miller," the girl replied, her voice wavering slightly. He skimmed over the documents. The case seemed straightforward, a high school fight that had escalated into violence. The victim, the son of a prominent businessman, had ended up in the hospital with a concussion. The accused, a 16-year-old girl, had been arrested on the spot. There were witnesses, conflicting testimonies, and a lot of public pressure for a quick resolution. Judge Howard sighed, glancing toward the prosecuting attorney, who was already straightening his tie, preparing to present his argument. But something didn't sit right. Howard had been on the bench for over 20 years, and he had developed a sense for when something was off. It wasn't just the way the girl was holding herself, it was the way she had entered the courtroom, her movements precise and controlled. He had seen plenty of scared kids in his courtroom, and they all had a certain jitteriness about them. This girl, though she looked nervous, didn't have that same desperation. There was something else in her expression, something calculated. He glanced toward the audience and immediately spotted a man in a navy blue suit sitting in the back. Unlike the others in the courtroom, he wasn't focused on the judge or the attorneys. His sharp eyes were locked on Sarah, watching her every move. "Miss Miller," Howard said, leaning forward slightly. "Can you explain, in your own words, what happened on the day of the incident?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the man in the suit. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Howard caught it. Then she exhaled, squared her shoulders, and did something no one expected. She lifted her chin and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Your Honor, I am not a high school student. My real name is Rachel Brooks. I am 26 years old, and I am a police officer working undercover." The room fell silent. Judge Howard slowly removed his glasses, staring at her. "I'm sorry, what?" Rachel turned to face the courtroom, her face calm, though her hands remained clenched. "I have been assigned to this high school for the past 8 months as part of an undercover operation investigating criminal activity among students. The fight in question was not a simple altercation. It was an attempted murder." Murmurs broke out across the room. The prosecuting attorney turned pale, his prepared statement useless now. Judge Howard's grip on the case file tightened. He looked back at the man in the suit, who had now stood up, his face unreadable. "And who exactly is this man watching you so closely?" Howard asked, his voice measured. Rachel barely glanced at him before answering. "That is Captain Thomas Lynch, my superior officer and head of this operation." Howard turned to Lynch. "Captain, is this true?" Lynch gave a curt nod. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, I have a feeling this just became a much bigger case than I was expecting." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, rippling through the audience like a shockwave. Judge Howard let the noise continue for a moment before striking his gavel against the wood. The sharp sound cut through the whispers, forcing the room back into silence. He adjusted his glasses and turned his gaze toward the young woman standing before him. Miss Brooks, he said slowly, the weight of her revelation still settling in his mind. You are telling this court that you are not, in fact, a 16-year-old high school student, but a 26-year-old police officer working undercover? Rachel nodded, her expression composed. That is correct, Your Honor. Howard glanced toward the prosecution, whose face had gone pale. He then turned his attention to Captain Thomas Lynch, the man who had been watching Rachel so closely from the audience. Captain Lynch, I assume you can verify this claim? Lynch stepped forward, standing with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control of a room. Yes, Your Honor. Officer Brooks has been part of an extensive undercover operation targeting organized criminal activity within Lincoln High School. Her assignment was to infiltrate a student network suspected of drug distribution, weapons sales, and extortion. This case is far more complex than it appears on the surface. Howard let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming against the bench. And why, exactly, is this the first time I am hearing about it? Rachel glanced briefly at Lynch before answering. Because my cover was still intact until this moment. Revealing my identity any earlier would have compromised the entire investigation. The suspect in question, Kyle Harrington, is not just some student caught up in a fight. He is directly connected to a larger criminal operation, and he identified me as a threat. The judge studied her carefully. You are referring to the alleged victim of this case? Rachel nodded. Yes, sir. He confronted me in an alley behind the school, not for a simple altercation, but with the intention of ensuring I would never leave that alley alive. I defended myself. He went down, and before I could process what had happened, authorities arrived and arrested me without question. The prosecuting attorney, still stunned, finally found his voice. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant, Officer Brooks, is only now revealing critical information that completely alters the case. Howard shot him a sharp look. That much is obvious. He turned back to Rachel. You are telling me, under oath, that Kyle Harrington intended to kill you? Yes, Your Honor, she replied without hesitation. And I have evidence to prove it. Lynch reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, stepping forward to hand it to the bailiff. This contains an audio recording from Officer Brooks' wire. The suspect explicitly threatened her life. The bailiff took the drive and handed it to the court clerk, who quickly inserted it into the system. A moment later, a voice crackled through the speakers. Kyle Harrington's voice was unmistakable, low, smug, and laced with malice. You think I don't know who you really are? You've been sniffing around too much, asking too many questions. You don't walk away from this, sweetheart. You don't walk away at all. A murmur of shock spread through the courtroom. The recording continued, capturing the unmistakable sound of a struggle, Rachel's sharp intake of breath, the scuffle of feet on pavement, and then a loud thud followed by Kyle's pained grunt. Judge Howard listened intently, his expression unreadable. When the recording ended, silence hung in the air. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, I request a recess too. Howard held up a hand, silencing him. He turned to Rachel, his gaze firm. Officer Brooks, given this new information, I need to ask you one final question before deciding how we proceed. Rachel straightened, her hands steady at her sides. Of course, Your Honor. Howard leaned forward slightly. If the authorities had not arrived when they did, do you believe Kyle Harrington would have killed you? Rachel met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, sir. Without a doubt. Howard exhaled, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk. Then it appears we are no longer dealing with a simple case of school violence. This is now an attempted murder investigation. The courtroom erupted into chaos, but Rachel didn't flinch. She had known this moment was coming. Now, the real fight was about to begin. The courtroom was in uproar. Voices overlapped, disbelief and shock filling the air as attorneys murmured among themselves and spectators whispered hurriedly. Judge Howard let the noise continue for a few seconds before slamming his gavel down twice, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "Enough. This court will have order," he commanded. The voices died down, but the tension remained thick in the air. Howard removed his glasses, rubbing his temple before turning his attention back to Rachel. The weight of what had just been revealed hung heavily over the room. He had walked into this case expecting a routine juvenile assault hearing. Instead, he had just uncovered a high-stakes undercover operation that had put an officer's life at risk. He turned his attention to Captain Lynch, who remained standing with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture unreadable. "Captain Lynch, given the nature of this case, why wasn't the court informed sooner? Why was I prepared to rule on a simple assault charge when, in reality, we are looking at an attempted murder situation?" Lynch met his gaze evenly. "Your Honor, the secrecy of this operation was critical. If Officer Brooks' cover had been compromised at any point before today, it could have cost her life. We had to wait for the right moment to intervene, ensuring that we had gathered enough evidence to take down the entire network involved." Howard frowned. "And you are certain this case extends beyond just one violent student?" Lynch nodded. "We have strong reason to believe that Kyle Harrington was more than just a school bully. He was acting under the orders of a larger criminal organization, using his status and connections to recruit students into illegal activities. Officer Brooks was close to uncovering their full operation when she was targeted." Howard turned his attention back to Rachel, his expression sharp. "How long had you suspected Harrington was involved in this organization?" Rachel straightened her shoulders. "Almost from the start. He wasn't just a troublemaker. He controlled certain students, intimidated others, and had access to resources no normal high schooler should. He was the one giving orders, not just following them. That's why my assignment took so long. I had to get close enough to gather evidence without blowing my cover." The judge studied her for a moment, then leaned forward. "And on the day of the incident, you are saying he confronted you, recognizing that you were undercover?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, sir. I had been careful, but I underestimated him. He had been watching me just as much as I had been watching him. He lured me to that alley, pretending he wanted to talk in private. The moment I realized what was happening, it was too late." Howard flipped through the file in front of him, shaking his head. "According to this case report, the initial statement from witnesses suggested you were the aggressor. How did that happen?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "Because Harrington had people ready to lie for him. When I fought back, he went down hard. By the time others arrived, he played the victim, claiming I attacked him without provocation. His father's influence ensured that I was taken into custody immediately, without a proper investigation." Howard shifted his gaze to the prosecution. "Were you aware of this when building your case?" The prosecutor, clearly rattled, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we were only working with the evidence provided by the arresting officers at the scene." Howard's eyes narrowed. "Evidence that ignored the fact that the supposed victim was caught on tape making death threats?" The prosecutor faltered. "That evidence was not provided to us until today." Howard exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable." He turned back to Lynch. "What happens now?" Lynch glanced at Rachel before answering. "Now, we finish what we started. With Officer Brooks' cover blown, we have enough evidence to move forward with arrests. Kyle Harrington may be in the hospital, but he won't be there forever. The moment he's released, he'll be taken into custody, and we will pursue charges against those above him as well." Howard considered this before nodding. "And Officer Brooks?" Rachel spoke before Lynch could. "I want to see this through," she said firmly. "I may not be undercover anymore, but I still have information that can help take them down." Lynch didn't look surprised, but there was something in his expression, reluctance, maybe even concern. Howard tapped his gavel lightly against the bench. "Very well. The assault charges against Officer Brooks are hereby dropped. This case is no longer about schoolyard violence, it's a criminal investigation. This court will reconvene once the prosecution is prepared to file charges against the appropriate individuals. Until then, Officer Brooks, you are free to go." Rachel exhaled, tension leaving her body for the first time since she had stepped into the courtroom. But she knew it wasn't over. If anything, the real fight was just beginning. Rachel stepped out of the courthouse, inhaling the crisp afternoon air as the weight of the last few hours settled over her. The adrenaline that had kept her steady during the hearing was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion. Captain Lynch walked beside her, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark overcoat. Neither of them spoke until they reached the parking lot. Rachel finally turned to face him. "So what happens now?" Lynch exhaled, scanning the area as if considering his words carefully. "We move forward. Harrington is still in the hospital, but the moment he's discharged, he'll be arrested. His father won't be able to protect him this time, not with the evidence we have. But he's just one piece of the puzzle. The real problem is the people he was working for." Rachel nodded. She had spent months trying to track the connections between Kyle and the larger criminal network operating in the city. He wasn't the mastermind, he was a recruiter, someone who manipulated younger students into joining the operation. Drugs, illegal weapons, blackmail, he had his hands in all of it, but he wasn't the one running the show. "They'll know my cover is blown," she said, more to herself than to Lynch. "They already do," he replied. "Which means you're a target now." Rachel clenched her jaw. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it real. She wasn't just off the case, she was in danger. "Are we pulling the plug on the operation?" she asked. Lynch shook his head. "No. We're too close to tearing this thing apart. We have to move fast, but we also have to be careful. The people behind this aren't just street-level criminals. They have influence, resources, people in high places protecting them. We can't afford any mistakes." Rachel crossed her arms. "So what's the plan?" Lynch hesitated. "First, we need you somewhere safe. No more going back to that school, no more pretending to be Sarah Miller. The department is setting up a secure location for you until we get this under control." Rachel tensed. "You're sidelining me." "It's not about sidelining you," Lynch said firmly. "It's about keeping you alive. You were lucky Harrington didn't finish the job that night. We're not giving him or anyone else another chance." Rachel wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She had spent the last 8 months walking a fine line, getting close to dangerous people without revealing who she really was. But the moment Harrington figured her out, that line had been crossed. Still, she couldn't just sit back and wait. "There's still more I can do," she insisted. "I know these people, I know how they operate. Even if I'm out of the field, I can still help from the inside." Lynch studied her for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. But you follow my orders. No solo missions, no risks, no stepping outside protocol. You're officially off the case, but I'll find a way to keep you in the loop." Rachel exhaled, relieved that she wasn't being completely cut out. Lynch's expression darkened slightly. "There's one more thing. Harrington's father is going to fight this with everything he's got. He's already trying to pull strings to keep his son out of jail." Rachel wasn't surprised. Kyle's father, Richard Harrington, was a powerful businessman with deep political ties. He had built his reputation on wealth and influence, and he wasn't going to let his son's arrest ruin that. "So what do we do?" she asked. Lynch's lips pressed into a thin line. "We make sure the truth comes out before he can bury it. The evidence you collected is solid, but we need more. We need to dismantle the entire network, not just take down one spoiled rich kid." Rachel nodded. She wasn't done. Not yet. Lynch checked his watch. "Come on. Let's get you to the safe house before someone decides to come looking for you." Rachel followed him toward the car, her mind already racing through the possibilities. The mission wasn't over. It was just getting started. Rachel sat in the passenger seat of Lynch's car, watching the city blur past as they drove through the quieter parts of town. The adrenaline from the courtroom had worn off completely, leaving behind an exhaustion that settled deep into her bones. She had spent 8 months walking the halls of Lincoln High, playing the role of an ordinary student, getting close to criminals who had no idea she was watching them. Now, in the span of a single day, everything had changed. Lynch drove in silence, his grip firm on the wheel. She knew he was thinking through the next steps, trying to anticipate problems before they arose. That was his job: control, predict, protect. Rachel, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Kyle Harrington. He had come so close to killing her. If the police had arrived a few minutes later, she wouldn't be here right now. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that he had known exactly who she was. Someone had tipped him off. She turned her head toward Lynch. Kyle didn't figure me out on his own. Lynch didn't react right away, but his jaw tightened slightly. I know, he admitted. That's what worries me the most. Rachel frowned. Then that means we have a leak. Lynch exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. We don't know that for sure. Rachel crossed her arms. Come on. Kyle's smart, but not that smart. I was careful. He wasn't suspicious until the very end, and even then, he didn't have proof. Someone told him. Lynch sighed. It's possible. It's the only explanation, Rachel pressed. Someone in our department, or someone connected to the investigation, fed him information. That's why he set me up. Lynch glanced at her before returning his focus to the road. Even if you're right, we can't jump to conclusions. If there's a leak, we have to be sure before we start pointing fingers. Otherwise, we tip them off and lose our only chance to catch them. Rachel hated that he was right. Every instinct told her that someone had betrayed her, but without proof, accusing the wrong person would only make things worse. Lynch pulled onto a side street and slowed down as they approached a small, nondescript house with a gated front yard. The windows were covered with blackout curtains, and a single porch light flickered dimly. This is the safe house, he said, putting the car in park. Rachel looked at the house. It didn't look like much, but that was the point. It was meant to be forgettable, unremarkable. A place no one would think to look for her. Lynch shut off the engine and turned to her. You'll stay here until we figure out our next move. The place is secure, bulletproof windows, reinforced doors, cameras on every entrance. No one gets in or out without us knowing. Rachel unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't move right away. And what am I supposed to do while I'm locked away in here? Lynch leaned back slightly. Stay alive. Rachel scoffed. I can do that anywhere. You say that now, Lynch said, but Kyle isn't the only one who wants you dead. Whoever he was working for, they won't stop just because he's in the hospital. Rachel knew he was right, but the idea of hiding made her skin crawl. She had spent months gathering information, risking her life to get close to these criminals, and now she was being sidelined when they were finally close to shutting them down. Lynch must have read the frustration on her face because he sighed. Look, I know this isn't what you want. But right now, you're a liability. If you try to jump back into the field, you'll only make it easier for them to find you. Rachel clenched her fists. So what, I just sit here and wait? Lynch smirked slightly. I didn't say that. She raised an eyebrow. Lynch reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone, handing it to her. Stay off your personal accounts. No calls to friends, no messages that can be traced. This phone connects only to me and a secure line at the department. Rachel took the phone and turned it over in her hands. So I can still help? Lynch nodded. From here, yeah. I'll send you files to go through, information we need analyzed. You know this case better than anyone, and we could use that. Rachel exhaled, feeling some of the tension ease. Okay. I can work with that. Lynch got out of the car, walking around to the passenger side as Rachel stepped out. He led her up the steps to the front door, punching in a security code on a keypad before unlocking it. The interior was minimal, barely furnished, everything functional but devoid of personality. A couch, a kitchen table, a small TV. "You'll be safe here," Lynch said. "But don't get comfortable. This isn't permanent." Rachel glanced around, then met his eyes. "It never is." Lynch smirked slightly. "Get some rest. You're gonna need it." He turned to leave, but Rachel stopped him. "Lynch." He looked back. "If there's a leak," she said, "you need to find out who it is before they find me." Lynch's expression darkened. "I know." With that, he stepped outside and locked the door behind him. Rachel stood in the middle of the room, listening to the silence. She wasn't afraid of being alone. She was afraid of what would happen next. She walked over to the couch, sat down, and turned on the burner phone. If someone had betrayed her, she was going to find out who. And when she did, they were going to regret it. Rachel sat on the worn-out couch, staring at the burner phone in her hands. The dim light from the small table lamp barely illuminated the safe house, casting long shadows across the room. The silence pressed down on her, heavier than she had expected. She had spent the last 8 months surrounded by noise, hallways full of students, crowded lunch tables, the constant buzz of conversation. Now, all she had was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. She exhaled, forcing herself to focus. She had a job to do, even from here. She powered on the phone and waited. A few seconds later, a single message appeared from an unknown number. "Secure line active. Expect files soon, ****. Rachel leaned back against the couch, her mind already racing. Lynch had said she would still be useful, but she knew this wasn't the same as being out in the field. She wasn't chasing leads, wasn't watching suspects up close. She was a step behind now, relying on information being fed to her instead of gathering it herself. The screen lit up again. A file transfer request appeared, and she quickly accepted it. A folder labeled Op Crimson, Priority Targets opened, revealing a series of documents and photographs. Rachel's breath caught as she scrolled through the names. She recognized most of them, students, local gang affiliates, even a few known dealers who had been working through the school. But it was the last name that made her heart stop. Detective Mark Calloway. Rachel's stomach tightened. She read it again, hoping she had made a mistake. But there it was, in black and white. Calloway was a veteran detective, someone she had worked with briefly before going undercover. He had been one of the officers responsible for overseeing the intelligence coming in from her investigation. If his name was on this list, that meant one thing: he was dirty. Her fingers tightened around the phone. This explained everything. He was the leak. He was the one who had tipped Kyle off, the one who had put a target on her back. Rachel swallowed hard, trying to process it. Calloway had always seemed like a good cop, someone who kept his head down and did his job. He had been in the department for over 20 years, respected by almost everyone. If he was involved, then this wasn't just about students dealing drugs. This was something much bigger. Her mind raced through the possibilities. If Calloway was working with the criminals, how deep did it go? Was he protecting them? Taking bribes? Feeding them information about investigations? And most importantly, how much danger was she in now that she knew? She needed to tell Lynch. Her fingers flew over the keypad, composing a message. "Call me. Now, ****. Seconds later, the phone buzzed. She answered immediately. "Lynch," she said, her voice sharp, "we have a problem." There was a pause on the other end. "I'm listening." Rachel took a steadying breath. "Calloway. He's the leak." Another pause. Longer this time. "You sure?" Lynch's voice was unreadable, but Rachel knew what he was thinking. If she was wrong, This accusation could destroy a man's career. If she was right, it meant their entire operation had been compromised from the inside. "I have his name in the files you just sent me," she said. "He's listed as a priority target. Either someone made a mistake, or we have a dirty cop in the department." Lynch exhaled through his nose. "I'll look into it." Rachel clenched her jaw. "That's not enough. We need to act before he realizes we're onto him." "And do what?" Lynch asked. "You're sitting in a safe house for a reason. If Calloway finds out you're alive and digging into this, you won't be safe." Rachel's grip tightened on the phone. "I was never safe. You said it yourself, whoever Kyle was working for won't stop just because he's in the hospital. If Calloway is part of this, then he already knows I survived. The only difference is now, I know about him too." Lynch didn't answer right away. She could hear him moving, likely pacing in his office. Finally, he spoke. "I'll handle it." Rachel frowned. "That's not good enough." "Rachel," Lynch said, his voice firm, "this isn't a game. You just found out that a senior detective might be working with criminals, and your first instinct is to do what? Go after him yourself?" She didn't answer. "That's what I thought," he said. "You're staying put. I'll take care of Calloway. You focus on going through those files and finding anything else we might have missed." Rachel clenched her jaw but didn't argue. "Good," Lynch said. "I'll call you when I have something. Until then, don't do anything stupid." The line went dead. Rachel tossed the phone onto the couch and ran a hand through her hair. She knew Lynch meant well. He was doing his job, trying to keep her alive. But every second they wasted, Calloway was getting further ahead, covering his tracks, making sure they'd never be able to pin anything on him. Rachel had spent months gathering evidence on high school criminals, never realizing that the real threat had been sitting inside the police department the whole time. She wasn't about to let him get away with it. Rachel sat in the dimly lit safe house, her mind racing as she stared at the burner phone resting on the table in front of her. Lynch had told her to stay put, to wait while he handled Calloway. But waiting wasn't something she was good at. She had spent the last 8 months taking action, carefully maneuvering through the halls of Lincoln High, gathering intel, making connections, and risking her life to expose the network that had taken root inside the school. Now, she was expected to sit on the sidelines while someone else did the work. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, trying to think logically. Lynch was right about one thing: Calloway was dangerous. If he had been feeding Kyle information, then there was no telling how much control he had over this operation. If they moved too soon, he would see them coming and disappear before they had a chance to stop him. Rachel exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think like she was still undercover. She needed a way to get more information without drawing attention to herself. She needed to know just how deep Calloway's involvement ran. She grabbed the burner phone and scrolled through the files Lynch had sent. Most of the documents were ones she had already seen: surveillance notes, financial records, and student reports. But one file caught her eye. It was a series of phone logs, listing outgoing and incoming calls from suspected members of the operation. She quickly scanned the list, searching for Calloway's number. There it was. His number appeared multiple times, always calling the same contact, a burner phone registered to an unknown alias. The calls had been frequent, sometimes multiple times a day. Rachel frowned. If Calloway was reporting to someone, then that meant he wasn't at the top of the chain. He was answering to someone else. Rachel's heart pounded as she cross-referenced the unknown number with other logs in the database. Her breath caught when she found another match. The same number had been in contact with Kyle Harrington, along with several other names from her undercover operation. Whoever owned that number was the real leader. She needed to trace it. Rachel grabbed her laptop from her bag and quickly set up a secure connection. She wasn't supposed to access police databases from the safe house, but she had never been good at following orders when they got in the way of progress. With a few keystrokes, she ran the unknown number through the system, searching for any matches. It only took a few seconds for a name to appear on the screen. Nathaniel Reed. Rachel's blood ran cold. Reed wasn't just some low-level criminal. He was a well-connected businessman with a spotless public record. He had investments in real estate, tech startups, and several city infrastructure projects. But Rachel knew his type. The kind of man who built his wealth by stepping on people who couldn't fight back. The kind of man who could hide illegal activity behind legitimate businesses, making it nearly impossible to link him to anything criminal. Except now, she had a link. Rachel sat back, staring at the name on the screen. Calloway had been working for Reed. Kyle had been working for Reed. And if Reed was the one pulling the strings, that meant this operation was bigger than anyone had realized. The burner phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She grabbed it and answered. Lynch. Tell me you've been sitting still like I told you to. His voice came through the line, laced with suspicion. Rachel hesitated for half a second. Define sitting still. Lynch groaned. What did you do? I found the real boss, she said. There was silence on the other end. Repeat that, Lynch said, his voice dangerously calm. I traced Calloway's calls. He's been reporting to someone named Nathaniel Reed. The same number has been linked to multiple people in the network, including Kyle. Lynch cursed under his breath. You're sure? I ran the number through the system. It's his. Lynch didn't respond right away, and Rachel could picture him pacing in his office, rubbing his forehead the way he always did when things got complicated. This just got a hell of a lot bigger, he muttered. Rachel already knew that. Reed wasn't just another criminal. He was the kind of man who had people in his pocket, judges, politicians, law enforcement. If they wanted to take him down, they couldn't just rely on the evidence they had. They needed to be smart. What's the move? She asked. Lynch sighed. I need to verify this before we act. If we go after Reed without airtight proof, he'll bury this before we even get a warrant. Rachel frowned. And if we wait too long, he'll realize we're onto him and disappear. I know, Lynch said. Which is why you need to let me handle this. Rachel clenched her jaw. She knew Lynch was trying to protect her, but she had spent too long in the middle of this fight to walk away now. I'm not backing off, she said firmly. I figured you'd say that, Lynch said, his voice carrying a hint of resignation. Fine. But you follow my lead. No going rogue. Rachel exhaled. Deal. There was a pause before Lynch spoke again. You did good, Brooks. Rachel didn't allow herself to feel pride. Not yet. They had found the man at the top, but that didn't mean they had one. It only meant that the real battle was just beginning. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small kitchen table in the safe house, her laptop open, the screen casting a dim glow across her face as she scrolled through every piece of information she could find on Nathaniel Reed. Every public record, every news article, every business dealing that had his name attached to it. He was careful, too careful, never directly tied to anything illegal, always operating through intermediaries, through shell companies, through people like Calloway and Kyle Harrington who did the dirty work for him while he sat comfortably in his high-rise office, untouched and untouchable. She knew men like him. Powerful, protected, the kind who thought they were above the law because, most of the time, they were. He had spent years building a network of influence, bribing the right people, silencing the wrong ones, covering his tracks so meticulously that even when something pointed to him, it was never enough to bring him down. If Lynch was right about how deep this went, there were more people than just Calloway working for him. There were people inside the system, people who had ensured that every time a case got close, it quietly disappeared before it could reach the courts. Rachel leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, exhaustion clawing at the edges of her mind but refusing to fully take hold. She had been undercover long enough to know that cases like this didn't end in a single arrest. Even if they took Calloway down, even if they got Kyle to talk, even if they found enough evidence to issue a warrant for Reed, it wouldn't be enough. He would have backup plans, lawyers, connections that could make everything disappear if they didn't do this right. The burner phone buzzed beside her, the sound startling in the silent room. She grabbed it immediately, already knowing it was Lynch. She pressed it to her ear without hesitation. "Tell me you have something," she said, skipping any greeting. "I verified your lead," Lynch said, his voice quieter than usual, which meant he wasn't in his office. "Calloway's been making regular payments to a company that doesn't exist. That company is linked to Reed's real estate firm." "You were right. He's been on the payroll for years." Rachel exhaled, part relief, part frustration. They had their proof, but it still wasn't enough to take Reed down. "So what's the plan?" she asked, already knowing Lynch had one. "We arrest Calloway first," Lynch said. "We hit him before Reed has a chance to cut him loose. If we can turn him, get him to roll over on Reed, we have a chance at taking this higher than anyone ever has." Rachel frowned, staring at the laptop screen where Reed's face was displayed on a news article about one of his recent investments. "Calloway is a cop. Even if we have evidence against him, do you really think he'll talk?" Lynch sighed. "Not willingly. But we're charging him with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding and abetting attempted murder. He's looking at life if he doesn't cooperate." Rachel wasn't convinced. Calloway had been in the game too long. He knew how to play the system, knew how to stall an investigation, knew that if he waited long enough, Reed would find a way to make this all go away. He wouldn't crack unless he thought there was no way out. "You need to cut off his safety net," Rachel said. "If Reed thinks he's a liability, he'll leave him to rot. But as long as Calloway thinks he still has protection, he won't say a word." There was a pause, then a low hum from Lynch, the sound he made when he was considering something. "What are you thinking?" Rachel hesitated, knowing Lynch wouldn't like it, but she had already made up her mind. "I make sure Reed knows Calloway got sloppy. We leak just enough information to make Reed nervous, let him think Calloway might talk." Lynch's voice sharpened immediately. "That's too risky. If Reed thinks Calloway's a liability, he won't just cut him off, he'll silence him permanently. We need Calloway alive." Rachel clenched her jaw. "Then we control the narrative. We don't make it obvious. We let it slip just enough for Reed to doubt him, but not enough for him to make a move before we do." Lynch exhaled, clearly weighing the risk. "If we do this, we have to be precise. One wrong move, and we lose everything." Rachel nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know." There was a long pause before Lynch spoke again. "I don't like it, but it's our best shot." Rachel felt a flicker of satisfaction. "So when do we move?" "Tonight," Lynch said. "We're picking up Calloway at his house before he gets wind of anything. Once we have him, you'll make your move." Rachel closed her laptop, already feeling the rush of adrenaline return. "Then let's finish this." She hung up before Lynch could argue any further, knowing that he would if she gave him the chance. He wanted to protect her, wanted to keep her in the safe house where she was out of reach, but she wasn't the kind of person who sat back and waited for things to happen. This had started with her, and she was going to be the one to end it. She stood up, grabbing her jacket, slipping the burner phone into her pocket. If everything went according to plan, by the end of the night, Calloway would be in custody, Reed would be exposed, and the entire operation would come crashing down. And if something went wrong? Rachel didn't let herself think about that. She had come too far to fail now. The ending of this story isn't just about justice, it's about exposure. Rachel's journey from an undercover officer to a key player in dismantling a criminal network is proof that sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones operating in the shadows, but the ones hiding in plain sight. Her story isn't about heroics in the traditional sense. It's about sacrifice, resilience, and the fine line between doing the right thing and surviving long enough to make it matter. She was thrown into a game where the rules were rigged against her, where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, and where even the people meant to uphold the law could be corrupted. But she didn't back down. The moment she uncovered the truth about Calloway and Reed, the fight stopped being about her mission and became personal. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she refused to let the system silence her. She knew the risks, knew that people like Reed didn't just go down without a fight. But she also knew that if she did nothing, he would keep ruining lives, keep manipulating the law, keep operating like he was untouchable. The best part of this ending isn't that Rachel wins, it's that she proves that the system, despite its flaws, can still work when the right people refuse to look away. She exposes corruption from within, she turns the tables on those who thought they were in control, and she forces people to see what they wanted to ignore. Does it come at a cost? Absolutely. She'll never be the same after this. She's lost her cover, she's made powerful enemies, and she's seen firsthand how deep corruption can run. But she also knows something even more important: she didn't break. And as long as she's still standing, she's not done fighting. Because justice isn't about what happens in a single courtroom. It's about what comes next.